probably noticed by the signs around town, it's the 100th year anniversary of town. And the Locke Foundation is dedicated to making Locke and its history, its very valuable, unique history, preserved for the next 100th year. So anything, of course our book is for purchase here, and that profit goes towards the Locke Foundation, and anything that you can do to help the Locke Foundation is greatly appreciated. So, thank you. To begin with, I think it's a good spot to start talking about how my involvement began with the town. In 1970, I had finished up with a photography school in Sacramento, Glenn Fishback School of Photography. And even though I had spent a little bit of time in San Francisco with kind of the early Rolling Stone group of photographers and such, I really didn't want to be in the city. Being in the country had some sort of draw for me that was just, underneath my skin. It was just something I always believed and felt. And so I had moved back from San Francisco and was living kind of temporarily in Sacramento. I was looking for a place to be, to follow my photography pursuits. And I was going between Sacramento and San Francisco, and I just pulled back down into Main Street here on that trip. And there was a building for rent. And that was the very end building, which I found out was called Happy's Cafe. And it had a sign for rent. And I just couldn't pass up the opportunity of living on Main Street. I really, I knew a little bit about Locke as a Chinese community, but it was living on Main Street in a little tiny town like this that just spoke to me. So I called up the number, and I think the rent was like $45 a month or something. So I said, sure, I'll do that. So I moved everything in, and I began my involvement with Locke. And living on Main Street was one thing. I became friends with Stanford King. He was the very first person who kind of befriended me. He lived at the top of the Levee Road over there. And every single day he would get into his maroon Lincoln Continental and drive from the front of his house there, come down to Main Street, make a U-turn, park in the front of the shop where he worked with Dustin Melon. And then in the evenings, he would get in his Lincoln Continental and drive back up and park. And then sometimes he would take walks, and he would come by, and he was intrigued, So he just came in and started chatting with me. And that was the beginning of the stories that I began to hear about Locke, and the understanding of the town, the population. He once told me that, above the Happy's Cafe also had a dance floor up above it. During the 20s and 30s, it was a very popular dance place where you could, do taxi dancing and such. But, so I lived there for a while, and then I eventually moved to Key Street, which is in the back of town here, and began to acquire more stories and such about the town. But I also began to be able to truly photograph the people in town back in, from living on Key Street there, particularly because of one involvement that I had with one of my neighbors, Mrs. Young, and she kind of became my adopted grandmother, who took me in and I helped them out, and then her and her husband always have meals for me. I'd go over and have meals and such. So, but by the end of the 1970s, I began to realize that I needed to do something more. And so I moved to San Francisco. It was kind of like I needed a big shock to my system. Of course, during the 70s, I had produced a number of images of the town, and felt that I had exhibited them pretty widely. The Chinese Cultural Center actually had a very large display of them in San Francisco, and packaged them into a traveling exhibition that traveled around the country, as well as I had them in various magazines and newspaper articles and such. But it was then living in San Francisco and getting to know Jeff here that it was like a epiphany. I had one time, I realized that I'd seen an article about Locke in some newspaper, and I just thought it was so surface. It didn't have any real context behind it. It was just like one of these articles of where the journalist and the photographer comes, fleeting in for the afternoon, takes some photos, and gets some stories, and that's the article. And I realized that I had been given a gift about a very special group of people, and that gift was the images that I had. And I needed to do something more with that. And that's when Jeff and I began to work together to figure out what to do more so with these images. And the outgrowth of that was the book Bitter Melon, where we did a whole series of oral histories, coming back and interviewing my neighbors and such, as well as getting the broader context of the Chinese experience here in California and in America from Su Chong Chan. But from actually the book, after the book being published and such, during all of that, I began to hear more and more stories about the town, the kind of the backdrops of things, and how all of this wasn't essentially just this little bit of history that I knew. And then I began to do some research and come up with some more things. And those are the stories that we're going to start to tell in Locke. I don't know, Jeff, you want to pick it up from here, or do you want me to go into my uncle's story about the town?
Well, why don't you tell your uncle's story about that? Talk about the research.
In about 1972, I was still living on Main Street, and I wanted to do something. I started to do also a lot of images of farm workers here, and my grandparents had a ranch, orange orchard and grape ranch outside of Fresno. And so I was on a trip down there visiting my aunt and uncle, and I discovered there was a small Hispanic community, and I ended up wanting to do kind of a documentary about this town. So I spent some months going down there and actually living down there. In the course of that, I came across one of my uncles who I hadn't really known that well. And he was telling, and I went over to his ranch and we were chatting, and he asked me, I told him, yeah, I'm living in Locke. And he goes, Locke? He goes, man, is that, Chinese? Yeah, I go, yeah. And he tells me this story. He was this farm kid from the outskirts of Fresno. He was fortunate enough to be able to go to UC Davis in the 1920s. And so he's like, I think he was a freshman or something. He and a couple of his fellow students, he tells me, they get onto a riverboat in Sacramento and come here to Locke because they had heard about this. This must have been 1922 or somewhere in that neighborhood. And he tells me he gets off and he'd never seen anything like this. This street, he said, there were thousands of people on it. At least for him, there was thousands. Every single building was all lit up. There was activity. There was cars going by. There was gambling. There was, these women of the night, up on the balconies and come on in, that kind of stuff. He said it was the most wildest experience that he had ever seen. And that was how he remembered Locke. And I guess they had, they had their drinks and they had a lot of fun. He says, yeah, we made it back. But he said that was his memory of Locke. And it was like one of those stories that I heard. I thought, my God. And I used to, after hearing that, I'd walk around at night thinking, God, what was this town like in the 1920s? What was this place throbbing with people? Because it was like, he said at least 2,000 people were here, from all over. And it must have been just fascinating, wonderful. And I say it was kind of like a combination of Las Vegas in its early days, Chicago, and Macau, all rolled into one little strip of buildings here. But how Locke comes to be, and the historical significance of it, and the pressures of why this was like that, is the stories that we have to tell now. Jeff?
Thanks for coming. James and I got together when we wrote Bitter Melon. We had been introduced by a friend, and The book doesn't exist without his literally thousands of photographs that he took of people that he lived with here and whose lives he recorded and memorialized in a really significant way. And I started to do the research that was very kind of academically oriented, and then we veered off and we did oral histories with everybody in town who was willing to be interviewed at that point. And I just wanted to set the context. It was interesting, I asked someone who gives tours here in town, what are the most common questions that you're asked? And he said, oh, they always want to know about all the vice. They want to know about the gambling and the prostitution and the opium dens and all of that stuff. And it's very interesting because the book that we put together is very, shall we say, family-oriented. It really focuses on the people who lived here and survived and persevered and prospered in not a traditional way. It's extremely interesting. Right next to Yancheng, there's the park, and then there was a whorehouse. There's no children here, so I use the terms that there are. We oftentimes call it a brothel. And I went, Molly, what's a brothel? There was a family, the Chang family, living next door. 8, 9, 10 kids. 10 kids, balconies front and back, and there's a whorehouse next door. So family, and then they went on to become physical therapists and architects and doctors and lawyers and everything else. I mean, a lot of us don't grow up in towns like that. So how did this town get like that? You know, what is this doing here? What happened? And one of the things, I mean, I'm going to show you a photograph here of, this is the Donald Trump of his age. This is the mayor of San Francisco at the time, James Phelan. James ran on a ticket in I can't remember, I think it was 1920. Keep California white, save California from Asian, Oriental aggression. Oriental aggression. And this was, he also had a conference in San Francisco in 1904 for the reenactment, the re-signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which passed in 1882. Leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act was some of the most vicious, violent episodes in the history of this country, which most people don't teach for some reason. The driving out. Towns existed all the way from Seattle down to Chula Vista, and the whites who disliked the fact that the Chinese were coming in here and taking their jobs that they didn't really want to do, building the railroads, building the levees, they drove them out. They burned their towns, they put them on railroad cars, they sent them to San Francisco, they killed people, they maimed people. The Delta was one of the only places, because so much of the labor that was used, people who built the levees were Chinese, and then they became the first farm laborers, the first farm tenants, the first sharecroppers, the first labor contractors in California, right here in this area, and they became a vital part of the economic well-being of the whole area. So they were allowed to, they became part of the whole structure here, and survived in a way that they did not anywhere else in the West. There's a lot of credit there to the people of the Delta, to the people of this area, who learned to live with others who were not totally like them. There was a lot of incentive to do that, in that they were making a lot of money. The Chinese were there's a book by Eileen's husband, $1 one day. They made $1 a day. Somebody else was making more than that off of these crops that were being built. So they were the foundation of the economic well-being of the Delta. But the violence and the driving out led to a series of laws that required Chinese people in this country, and I think other Asian, we're talking mostly about Chinese here, to go into other occupations that were not ones that other families at that time went into. And you'll see why. In 1879, the California Constitution was amended. This is 3 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act, to read that no native of China, no idiot, insane person, or person convicted of any infamous crime shall exercise the privileges of an elector in this state. Chinese are also excluded from employment with corporations and with state, county, and municipal governments. So you literally couldn't have a job. By 1882, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, you couldn't come into this country unless you were a merchant legally. You couldn't come in legally unless you were a merchant or somebody of the merchant class, a business person, i.e. you had to buy your way in. You had to have money to come in. You had to have something that was negotiable to the structure here so that you could make money and they could make money with you, and you were not, quote unquote, a laborer who was going to take away the job of, this was mostly an Irish working class led movement at the time, the Working Man's Party of San Francisco, Northern California. It was the driving force behind the Chinese Exclusion Act. Everyone always thinks of San Francisco as this liberal enclave. It didn't used to be. It used to be quite a reactionary place. Phelan and others were instrumental in keeping that act alive. Chinese were not allowed to testify against white people in court. That was true of African Americans as well as Japanese Americans. So, what do you do? What are you supposed to do? They were labor contractors. They were farm laborers. They were tenant farmers. But you still have thousands of people here who were common laborers. They were working in the fields for $1 a day. And there were people who were trying to make money and didn't have any other way to work. And so these businesses grew up that were quite profitable, that were not legal. But this was an ultimate outlaw class. This gentleman here, these women, these are all descendants of some of the most notorious outlaws in the history of the United States. They were, by definition, outlaws. They were not here legally. They were not allowed to work legally. So the fact that illegal businesses grew up isn't of any surprise whatsoever. There were also, it gets very complicated, and it's somewhat murky, and we'll get into it, the participation of the Tongs and the Chinese societies, the 6 companies and others. If law enforcement in this country isn't going to protect your community, somebody's going to protect your community. Somebody in that case happened to be Tongs. Tongs, in many cases, not all cases, were involved in the gambling business, in the prostitution business, and in the opium business. And these vices were what kind of attract people now. The town was very complex, just as San Francisco was very complex. At one point, a large percentage of the Chinese population there were involved in gambling and other vices, and that's because they weren't allowed to participate in anything else legally. Locke got here, by necessity, by the fact that it's very remote, and it was allowed, the currents that attacked and attracted violence against Chinese and other communities did not happen to the extent in the Delta that it happened there. A very discouraging part, actually the happy ending to this story is he didn't win re-election. His days were numbered in other ways, and he was, as Pete Wilson did in this state at one time when he ran very vigorously against Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans mostly. He won re-election, but he cost his party dearly over the years. This guy ran and just was never able to generate. He had other political problems, and he was trying to use xenophobia, racial animosity as a political platform to get himself in the back of the office, and it just didn't work. This was in the San Francisco Examiner 1 week ago, or 5 days ago. No more Chinese. Graffiti spray painted at 5 locations in San Francisco. I was very depressed to read this. And it was in a neighborhood that's a large number of Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans are moving into and opening up grocery stores and everything else. And somebody painted that. 3 days later, somebody was found. He was arrested. Security cameras found it. A guy named John Shinone, 62 years old, was charged with 13 counts, including felony vandalism with a hate crime enhancement by the district attorney's office. So, 100 years ago, he probably would have been given a banquet and paraded through the streets. Luckily, times have changed. He was arrested. This guy was not reelected, but as we can see by currents that are going on today against immigrants, all of this still goes on. But that's just a little background on how Locke got here and how the nature of the businesses. I mean, people have told us that at one point, just about every place along Main Street, at one time or another, had what one would call a vice occupation in it. Things floated from one building to another. Others were always gambling halls. There were 4 or 5 gambling halls in town. So we've got some stories from the book that we'll read, and James has some stories that we did a lot of research, mostly James did, into newspapers from the 19-teens, from the teens and the 20s. That have some stories in there that...
This is tales journal. Some of these are stories, and as I told in my introduction, I was told stories. I mean, one of the founding stories about Locke is the fire of 1915 that occurred in Walnut Grove on October the 7th. We actually have the articles from the fire somewhere around here, right in there. And so, you know, it says, well, the fire started. Okay, well, it was always, you know, it's like, oh, I think they say it started in somebody's washroom or something like that. That wasn't the stories that I was told. And, you know, so the stories that I was told, a couple of places too, actually, you know, Stanford, and then I became very close to a Chinese cook down in Isleton, Pineapple, who actually at one time ran a brothel here in London. She told me. That's a different story. But he said, no, this fire just didn't happen. This was actually, this was a turf war for gambling between one tone and another tone. And this fire got out of hand, and it started the fire that then burned the Chinese section down. And of course, then that led to the group of Dee Dee's grandfather, Charlie Lee Bing, who put together, you know, this group of people to come down here to Locke and to negotiate with the sons of George Locke and to tear out the orchard here and start building Main Street. So, but actually, you know, you have to go back a little bit in time to the 1906 earthquake and fire, because it was that event that essentially drove the Tones who were involved with the illegal gambling and prostitution and such, and disrupted essentially their business model there in San Francisco. And of course, because they were very active, they still had, you know, they were somewhat active in Sacramento, Stockton and such, and here in the river. But that development, that disruption of their whole business in San Francisco pushed them upriver here to where you then had much more active involvement, much more in, you know, the idea that, you know, can't be making money in San Francisco for a while, so we have to make money up here. And that was one of the things that kind of drove the gambling dispute there in Walnut Grove. So in some of this research, you know, I've heard these stories, and so it's just like, oh, okay, they're just stories. But then doing some research this last year, I came across these Sacramento Bee articles. That one was written in 1919, and it was done by Leslie Davis. And this, you know, it's there, but it was just so perfect. Gambling running free at towns in the Delta region. And it says, Lockport is Monte Carlo of the state. Working men's daily lose their savings to the Chinese. Games are also operated at Walnut Grove, Cortland, when raids have no terror for the Orientals. Well, what's unique about Locke, and what's, you know, in a sense, you know, to Charlie Lee Bing's great genius of how to make this all work, was that, as the article states here, Locke allowed anybody to come in and gamble. And according to the words that are used here, they allowed Americans to come in and gamble. Well, in Walnut Grove, and Cortland, Isleton, and such, they didn't allow Americans. And the reasons, the difference there was that Chinese and other Filipinos were not considered to be Americans, okay, because they couldn't be because of the 1882 Exclusion Act. But the genius of this was that because you then had not only, you know, a much wider audience for your business, but it also assured, in a sense, your protection. Because who's going to come in and bust all these, you know, the various, you know, the Americans who are here partaking of all this. You're not going to have this kind of police force. And that's what you see in these articles. That's one of the things that I was so intrigued about. Because if you follow these stories from the beginning, the first one I think is in October 1st, 1990, if I remember that. Yeah, October 1st, and then they go all the way through. And pretty soon you're reading, and you know, that the district attorney, the sheriff, and the constable that's out here, everybody's pointing fingers like this, going, I can't do it because he's not doing his job. And the other guy's saying, well, I can't do it because he's not doing his job. And the judges are, oh, well, they come into court, well, they get fined, this and that. You realize that everybody's on the take. Everybody's on the take here.
Yeah.
And then, it becomes even a little bit more obvious in doing my research. This is now in 1920. So in 1919, you have all this, and this was called Lockport in 1919. Then in 1920, now it's being referred to as Lock, and the gambling is still happening down here. Well, also in these series of other articles, I read about how there's this Lock gambler pleads guilty to killing player. And this is one George Shin, who's a 26-year-old Chinese, son of a Lock gambler. And he ends up shooting this guy from Klamath Falls. These two white guys, two Americans, have come down here to gamble. And they basically steal the money off the table and they run out. Well, George Shin comes out and he follows him and he grabs a gun from, I guess, one of the dealers and shoots the guy, kills him. Well, what's interesting here about it, if you read into the end of all of this, you find out that his attorney is this guy by the name of Luke Howe. Well, Luke Howe, he's being representative, I'm almost positive, and I think Dee Dee can verify this, that the gambling house where this happened was Charlie Lee Bing's gambling house, the Dailoy Museum. That's there now. So Luke Howe is we've heard this before. Jeff and I have talked particularly Dee Dee's father. That Luke Howe was the attorney, the personal attorney for Charlie Lee Bing. Well, what makes Luke Howe so interesting is that he is the ex-district attorney for Sacramento County.
City attorney.
City attorney, thank you. City attorney. So here's this guy, the personal attorney for this non-American, right, who obviously knows all the political connections. And actually George Shin, who was given a life sentence, a few years later gets paroled for whatever reason and comes back and lives in Lock. So that's what's amazing about some of these stories that I've heard, is that this begins to really fill out the facts with the tales that I've heard over time about how Locke, had this very rich history. And, as Jeff said, given the pressures that the population had of not being able to do anything, of how that they succeeded by figuring out how to navigate this really treacherous place called America and to be able to truly succeed. Because essentially, because of the foundation that Locke provided for the families to be able to be here and all the kids who were being able to be raised. And then, of course, that after World War II, you have the GI Bill that afforded everybody the opportunity to be able to go on and to pursue your true intellectual abilities, besides just being able to figure out how to, say, okay, well, like Charlie Lee Bing, he was obviously this incredibly intelligent, motivated human being who figured out a way to succeed here in America. And sure, it was illegal stuff, but what else was available if you were that smart? So now you have that next generation being able to succeed. So, Jeff, turn it over to you here for a minute.
Well, what's fascinating about this is, again, when we get back to the level of legality, we're talking about the Chinese are illegal here. Who's getting paid off? The district attorney the constable, the sheriff, all of that stuff. That's all illegal activity. So, again, you look in these mirrors and you're seeing a lot of distorted imagery about the whole thing. In many of these articles, if you get a chance to read these things, it's just fascinating. At one point, this reporter is a very zealous investigative reporter. Somehow he convinced his editors, I'm going to, I've discovered this whole nest of vice down in the Delta, and I'm going to go down and expose it. And they love it. This is front page. This is a front page article. Gambling flourishes at Monte Carlo of California. That's that one over here. A couple of weeks later, he comes back down. And he had gone to the sheriff, and he had gone to the district attorney and said, how is this happening? Why isn't somebody doing anything about this? And so, gambling flourishes like, as in days of yore, somehow the next year, the year before was the days of yore. He goes, do you want to gamble? Do you want to play Chuck-a-Luck, Fan-Tan, Chinese dominoes, or shoot crap? Go to Lot, a little town 30 miles or so down the Sacramento River. And he then goes on how disappointed he is that he's exposed all of this a year before, and it's all still going on. There's hundreds of people. In Lockport, he writes before, at Lockport, 8 gambling houses are devoted solely to gambling. I had only heard 4 or 5, 8, but so there's some freelance things going on at some point. Some side card games and the whole thing. 8 gambling houses going on, and 26 tables are set up for play. The most tables in one house are 7, and frequently the writer saw 6 of them in full blast. And several times the 7 were going full tilt, while a long bench was crowded with lottery players. So he's exposed all this. He goes to the sheriff. The sheriff says, hey, look, every time we go down there, we have to use our official cars. So it says sheriff on the side. By the time we get there, they've closed up. They've seen us coming. Well, that's the lamest excuse I've ever heard. Don't bring the official car. So he has to bring the official car. So they go to the district attorney and they said, come on, look at this. I've been exposing all of this. It's all in here. All of this is in here. He's writing about it. The district attorney says, the sheriff's got to arrest somebody. I can't prosecute somebody without the sheriff arresting somebody. That's what James said. They're all going like this. In Walnut Grove, the constable, a descendant of the Dye family, which is a very prominent family there, owned the land on which one of the gambling houses was. So this is all, under the table. Everybody's making a lot of money. There's a lot going on. And everybody's, this poor reporter, I've done this myself. I thought I was exposing all of this corruption of campaign contributions in San Francisco one time. And it gets published, but then nobody does anything about it. Nobody wanted to do anything about it. Well, here's the headline. Sheriff says he knows they gamble at Lock. Sub-headline. Signs on county cars, small force of deputies, and friendly juries, he says, prevent him from stopping it. So he's got Cortland, Walnut Grove, Lock, all gambling going full tilt with the sheriff.
Also, so after all this expose, what do they end up finally doing? Well, they raid one place in Walnut Grove. And the 5 raids, raid 5 games in Walnut Grove. They don't come to Lock. They go to Walnut Grove to do this raid, where it's all set up, and they get some sort of, the judge says, okay, I'll fine you a few $100 each. But that's the effect.
Well, they do raid Lock.
Yeah.
The grandson of the founder of the town here is in town, and his lovely wife. Dee Dee's not a gambling hall owner anymore.
I've heard my stories of
Yeah.
the strength of my grandfather was Luke Howe. Luke Howe was the man. I didn't know, you guys told me that he was a former city district attorney. My dad learned how to drive when he was 8 because evidently my grandfather didn't know how to drive, but he bought a car. Okay, so my dad had to learn how to drive, so he told me stories. And again, it's just a story, I don't know if it was true, but I would think that it would be that he got woken up at a young age, probably 10, that he had to get the car out and drive to Sacramento. What the heck? I mean, it's midnight, it's past midnight, I'm going to go to Sacramento. He goes, well, they arrested somebody at the Dye Lawyer. And they round up a bunch of people. He goes, but don't worry, we just got to go pick them up and take them home because Luke Howe already, by the time we get up there, because there was, was no cell phone, by the time we get up there, Luke has already smung them already. They probably didn't even make it up there. and we'll turn around and pick them up. But that was the story my dad would always say, God, he used to hate getting up in the middle of the night, just drive up there and pick up all the guys.
That became a kind of a charade, a game that they played. The sheriff would come down and he'd arrest a group of people, and they would take them to jail, and then they would get taken out. I mean, it's the way that they deal a lot with prostitution today. If they're getting paid off, you just go in there, you get out, you pay your bail, and you're gone. And this is a story from Bitter Melon. This was Joe Lung. He had many names, but this is what he looks like. He was a complete character. He lived here in town for many, many years. He worked as a labor, he worked for your grandfather for a while in the labor contracting business, and he did various jobs around town. But this is his language. This is the way he talked. This isn't our translation. We did half of the interviews in this book in Chinese with an interpreter, a young woman who lived in Connie Chan, and this was in half it was in English. And Mr. Lung did his interview with us in English, but he's telling the story here. There were 1, 2, 3 gambling houses in town. The sheriff around here was in Cortland. Goodman, one time, he said, I'm going to catch you gambling houses. 1 year I catch you 2 times and you better watch it. So the gambling houses had people who sat inside, watchmen who sat outside and watched for the police on the benches. Some of them had little peepholes inside that they could look out and see if the sheriff was coming in his marked car. So everybody could see him coming. Watch for the police. Police come, they lock all the doors. When the police leave, they can open up again. I remember one day this Hindu man comes up to the gambling house. He's got a turban, a towel wrapped around his head. Just a Hindu guy, and he drinks too. So the Hindu guy goes, me Hindu, let me inside. The watchman thinks he's just a Hindu guy. He can go inside. So he goes inside. Once he goes inside, he looks at everything. He takes off to the bar and orders a drink, looks around at everybody gambling. Then he takes off his towel and everybody turned around, and it was Goodman. What's he doing in the gambling house? Oh, that Goodman, he caught them good. He caught them and he set bail. Cost them $1,000. But he doesn't bother the boys or the workers. He wants the boss. $1,000 probably got passed back at some point. But anyway, I don't know what, but he doesn't bother the boys or the workers. He wants the boss. He bothers the boss. Charlie, everybody. But money talks. You got the money, all right, you can go. This is a charade. This is what the sheriff comes in, busts everybody, imposes a fine, goes away, gambling hall reopens again, everybody goes back gambling. Years and years and years.
When part of the research that I was doing for the anniversary for the 100th year celebration, I simply typed into Google and Wikipedia, and I came across the Chinese massacre of 1871. The Chinese massacre of 1871 was a racially motivated riot on October 24th, 1871 in Los Angeles, when a mob of over 500 men entered Chinatown to attack, rob, and murder Chinese residents of the city. The riots took place on Calle de los Negros, Street of the Negroes, also referred to as Nigger Alley, which later became part of Los Angeles Street. A total of 18 Chinese immigrants were systematically killed by the mob, making the so-called Chinatown War the largest incident of mass lynching in American history. That's just one of the more serious contexts of what was going on. And that wasn't that long.
We have a little bit more we wanted to go. I wanted to tell you the story of how an Italian restaurant named El Wops ended up in an all-Chinese town. It's a pretty good story, but before we get...
We're talking about the gambling, sort of the vice part. But in reading the book, what I was more fascinated with is that these were actually more, had a really social component as well. I mean, like the post office was there, et cetera. Can you talk to that issue?
Well, actually, I was going to read that section from Dee's grandfather. His father told the story of, it's a very short section here. In those days, it's a necessity. This is Ping Li, Ping Kan Li. He went by the name Ping Li at this point. In those days, it's a necessity. Ping was the unofficial mayor for years. A lot of you know who Ping is, I'm sure. extremely convivial and competent and congenial and talkative man. We had a lot of wonderful sessions with him. In those days, it's a necessity for the Chinese people to have a place to hang out. When you talk to anybody, they'll tell you that place was a gambling hall. It served as a labor hall and a social hall. There's a lot of people I know went into the gambling houses and never even gambled. They went there and drank tea that was free. There's a big pot of tea back there. There's musical instruments they play around with. Wong Buck, I don't know how long he has played those things. He loves Chinese music, you heard it. I can remember him. Wong Buck is about 80 years old now. All right, they get back there, the back of the gambling hall, and we're all shooting the breeze, all the Chinese guys. Sometimes, when we were dealing with laborers, it was called a bachelor society. Most of these people came over by themselves to make money and come back to China at some point, and the vast majority were men, single men, which is why you had the amenities such as whorehouses and gambling halls. There were anti-miscegenation laws that did not allow Chinese white women to marry Chinese men, vice versa. So if you didn't get married back in China, and there were no women here, hence the popularity of the whorehouses. Sometimes we play cards, not gambling on the table. We just play among ourselves. We have no newspaper here. We don't even have a post box. You're out working on the farm. Now you've rented a room and you share it for $5. You pay $2.50 a month. You split it with somebody. When there's no work, you come uptown. You don't sit in your room. You go down to the gambling house because everybody's there. So we shoot the breeze, and you happen to come back from China. Maybe I've sent a few bars of soap you took to my family back there, telling them I'm all right. Maybe next year I get a few bucks and I come back to see the family myself. So I see you, you tell me the news, I tell you, that's the way it's served. The next way is nobody has any post office box in town. Back at the gambling house, I wonder if Lorraine would dispute that. There was a post office in town, but I don't know if they had boxes or not. Back at the gambling house, there is a post slot where you can slip the papers in. You could come in town after a week on the ranch and look, you got a letter, you take it, it's yours. Or else you didn't come to town, but you work together and you see his mail and you take it back to him. Serves as a post office. Or a bunch of you might be horsing around playing pinochle back there, and somebody from Dennis Leary's ranch or Joe Blow's comes up needing 6 guys to clean up and get ready for fruit picking. You go in there and see three of us sitting in there and you say, hey, you guys working? No, we just finished jobs last week. So it was a gambling, it was a hiring hall as well. So that served as a social place.
Well, it's also, there's a big separation between Main Street and essentially the street, Key Street behind town, and the buildings behind. Main Street was really where all the activity was, but the familyness of Locke was really existed behind the town. That's what many of the kids that who are now adolescents, some passed away, who always talk about when they were growing up in the 20s, who were born in the 20s and 30s and such, growing up in Locke. It wasn't so much Main Street, but it was behind the town where all the activity took place for them. And so that was that. And, of course, by the Depression really had a very dynamic effect upon Locke and all of these activities. Everything definitely went down. But it was, during the 20s when things were really, of course, fueled by Prohibition too. It was one of the major sources of income for, one of our, Effie Ly's story, she talks about how her husband had lost a job and she had to, she was making liquor as a way to get some extra money coming in to support her family. So,
Any other questions?
We're growing up in the back streets. I mean, do their parents tell them not to go to Main Street, not to hang around certain buildings, that it's bad for you, or how? I mean, the kids came out okay.
Yeah, well, my dad would tell me what was his reason from coming up to Main Street. And his reason was, so a lot of these things that he said, I don't know, because I couldn't come up. We were living in the back street, and we drove our bicycle, play marbles, softball, but we weren't allowed on Main Street. If Mom told you to go to Incheon to go get a quart of milk, that's okay, but she told you. But we couldn't just wander, because there's so many alleys that led to Main Street, but we couldn't wander because, and my folks, the reason was, there's a lot of cars there, you could get run over. That's all I heard. I never knew anything else, and if that's what Mom said, oh, the obedient son, he said, okay, whatever you say, don't go up there, you get home, and somebody, especially the old Chinese that lived oftentimes, they tell on you left and right, man. It was like Gestapoville, man, here. I mean, they tell you that, oh, I saw your kid climbing up that tree. You know, and that night you come home and say, oh, man, do you see me climbing up that tree? So you couldn't do anything because all eyes, that was locked security cameras. Your closed circuit TVs were
Come on,
locked.
Jeannie, tell us the real story.
It was.
I think for Chinese, Cantonese as a region, it's very, I'm not a Cantonese, so I married into a Cantonese family. I noticed something very interesting, of course. Cantonese, when it comes to eating, you talk about gambling, it's not just a gambling hall, it's a social place. Well, eating, restaurant itself, it's a social place. If you go to dim sum place, you notice, especially in Hong Kong maybe, that people go there, or old men, or they go there at 10 o'clock, they sit there and have some tea and have maybe a little bow, and they read newspaper. And so that restaurant serve, eating and restaurants serve as a social occasion. Same thing as gambling hall. You know, gambling is very interesting. I look at it like, you know, I'm marrying here and like gambling hall. You know, it didn't sound good or right. You can't even, I didn't want to tell my kids, grandpa, you know, gambling hall.
I never said it.
And so,
You never told your kids?
well,
We mentioned it, but we never say, you know, like.
not really. But what's
Oh, let's get them on
interesting.
speakerphone here.
I know, right? So that's why it's very interesting. This year's centennial, we actually flew my daughter back from LA and my son from Davis, you know, and bring them in here. Grandpa took them here
Yeah, but it was
2 times, but it's different. So, you know, talking about gambling, it's very interesting that it relates to our family history too, because we have boxes of old black buttons at home. We have a lot of stuff because Ping lived with us. 1989, we moved to Walnut Grove, and the Can family or the Lee family just moved everything. The teapot and all the old spoons, just moved
You
it.
got most of that stuff from that dumpster, James.
And what's interesting about the button was that it just stayed at home. I thought maybe his wife's family, who used to live in Chinatown doing the sewing, kept a lot of thread, silk thread, and buttons. But I didn't realize it till this time, actually, when I brought my daughter into the Dialogue Gambling House, which is owned by great-grandpa, that my daughter looked at the button, and it says on the gambling table that Chinese use the button, so when you get caught, there's no money on the table. That's what the button, the whole
They didn't
box
know
is
what the
a button.
buttons were.
I'm like, Grandma saw a lot of
We
clothes.
sold a lot of clothes. We got all the same type of buttons too.
Thousands and millions of the buttons sitting there like, wow, it's hard work in making clothes.
Both my kids
No,
are very
they were-
enlightened. That's last time
They
they
were
were very
from the
enlightened
gambling
about
hall.
what
We've
was
got some
happening.
good, interesting family dinners coming up in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's
It's
great.
interesting.
Well, we asked that question of everybody that we interviewed about how do they relate to Main Street. And this is very apropos what you just said. This is Tommy King, Connie King's husband, who passed away before she did. And Tommy was a great interview. He goes, that's my father's garage right there. That would have been pointing right to the house that James lives in right now. That was the garage. And he said he kept the slot machines upstairs. He supplied the slot machines for the Delta. He had quite a few. He picked them up cargo freight from the Southern Pacific Depot in Walnut Grove. They came in from Chicago. You know about the gambling houses here, right? Ping Lee tell you what his father did? Did he tell you his father ran the gambling house in town? Well, Lee Bing never took slots. There weren't any slots in the gambling houses here. They had dice tables, blackjack, card games, cater some to the Caucasians, but no slot machines. And then just one other thing, Everett Leong, as just from the kids' perspective here, as I said, we asked everybody about it. He said, and then when I was about between 6 and 10, the town had a local gambling hall. I don't know, it was just down to 1 at that point, perhaps?
I don't know.
But anyway, I'd have to go back and see how old Everett was at that point. or what year that was. The town did a little gambling hall, and that provided a lot of action. A lot of kids hung around out there, not Dee Dee Conley.
No, I could not.
A lot of kids hung around out there. Several of us were shoe shine boys. We used to stick around there and shine a guy's shoes for 15 cents a shine. They had a chair out back so you could sit down. Plus there's shade. There used to be a big tree back there. The gambling hall right behind my mom's house, the Dai Loi. Ping Lee's father owned it. I never really went inside when I was a kid. Basically, I got as far as the door and the back porch and all that, but we knew that there was a lot of people in there, and we knew that there was money in there, and that if you stick around there long enough with your shoe shine box, the guy that wins will come out and get a shoe shine for 15 cents a shine, and he'll tip you 25.
Yeah.
That was the main gambling offer.
Yeah.
Well, also, we had just interviewed Lorraine Fong, whose building is the Wall Lee building here. And she was telling us about, I forget how many kids she was
9,
running?
I think.
9, yeah. But going back to your question, they, and yours too, that the kids would all come home after going to school and then, Chinese school, and then come inside, and they weren't allowed to go out. They had to come home and study and, work and do what they had to do. But they weren't allowed to. They could come out on the balcony and look, and they said that was pretty entertaining at times. But that was about as far as they could get. So,
Any other questions before we'll do the Al Wap story? And then, yes, sir.
I just wonder, particularly in light of Charlie Lee Bing's entrepreneurial skills and factors like the Prohibition starting in 1920, if it hadn't been for a fire, would there have been kind of more of a lock kind of a section in Walnut Grove?
Well, there was the Chung San section in Walnut Grove, or I don't know if it was a section, but that was the group of people that after the fire came up here. And I'm presuming they came up here, they didn't want to rebuild there because they were not getting along. These were ethnic rivalries that dated, that went back to the old country. They spoke different dialects, they had different customs, and they had different, I'm guessing at this, but I just know that the Bing Kong Tong was very powerful in Walnut Grove. Li Bing, as far as we could tell, was not a member of the Bing Kong Tong at that time. He was the special protege of one of the main characters, main business people in Walnut Grove, Alex Brown. The bank of Alex Brown was eventually started there. He started that bank by loaning money to Chinese and Japanese laborers out the back of his market, which is the big store there. And then it formally became a bank later on. And Charlie Lee Bing, he gave him the name Charlie from what we heard as his Chinese accomplice, and set him up in the gambling business there. Well, you got the Bing Kong Tong, the most powerful Tong in Northern California at that time by any reckoning that we have found. And then you got a guy who's running gambling halls without any Tong support. That's a pretty vulnerable position. Ping Lee told the story that if, the story on the street was if you mess with Li Bing, you're going to mess with Alex Brown. He's my boy, stay away from him, stuff like that. All right, I just saw a movie last night, Straight Outta Compton. It's a gangster rap. It doesn't look like a lot of gangster rap fans here. Fascinating film, absolutely fascinating.
Historical?
Wasn't it?
Yeah,
and really extremely well done. And, this was not, these guys were coming up in a system where gangs were running their neighborhood, and the police were a gang at that point. I mean, the LAPD was incredibly corrupt, led up to the Rodney King beating and all of that stuff. Well, this wasn't for the faint of heart. I mean, you're running a gambling hall in a town that's controlled by the Bing Kong Tong. You're playing with some pretty big forces there. So the fire, may or may not have been started by that, but they got out of there and then set up here. And I don't know how long he got away without living in the Tong. There's a tale there of that there was a hit put out on him, on your grandfather, and there was a man killed in the shower between Moon Cafe and the next building. There was an outdoor shower there, and that was supposed to be Dee Dee's grandfather, but it wasn't. They got the wrong guy. Somebody was killed there. So again, and then he left for 7 years. He went up to Grass Valley, and he raised his children out of town. These were strong, powerful forces at play, and it wasn't a game. his wife and stuff. So without the fire, would they have stayed there and peacefully coexisted? I'm thinking, no.
I'm thinking how they flourished here in Locke. And the remnant that was left in Walnut Grove, did they have gambling interests, and was it
Yeah, they
flourishing like Locke? Did they
rebuilt
flourish
that, yeah.
because of the Chonsan leaving?
These are, I'm starting to do more research into that, but I can't answer that question definitively. Do you have any information about that? About would they
Without
have?
the fire?
No, I wouldn't know.
Well,
That-
they
I mean,
rebuilt
they-
Chinatown there. again.
They rebuilt it, but I
And it
don't,
burned down again in the 30s.
yeah,
too.
I don't,
Yeah, second fire.
I mean, it was so far behind, you know, some of these things that I learned, the hearsay or the tales, were done when Dad and I were butchering together in the back of the meat market, and all of a sudden he'll see something and it'll remind him of memory, and he started talking, well, that lasts as far as the next customer coming in. Then it stopped, and then we both forgot it, and then if I did remember, he goes, oh, what's that about, Dad? What's that? Yeah. And so you just get chops and pieces and trying to piece it together, you know, usually Stuart came in and screwed it all up for us anyway. But that's a lot of that stuff. I know the Grass Valley story and the hit, and that he never told me until, geez, I must have been close to 40 years old before he even mentioned. Most of that stuff was not, you don't tell your children. The Chinese didn't tell your children the hardships, the stuff that they went through. You know, you gotta it's just like, that was, I forget it, it's all gone.
Well, the big difference between Walnut Grove and Locke was in the Leslie Davis story about how Locke catered to everybody. Americans could come in, and that was the big difference. That's why Locke really flourished. And again, you know, because
You know, Grandpa used to say to me, after I got out of college and got into business, you know, he didn't say it to me, but he said to my dad that I wish my grandson was born to maybe another 30, 40 years before. He goes, we could have done really good, you know, because I love to work and I love to do the things. But he mentioned those things that happened then that I could use another right-hand man really bad, you know.
well, you know, the other great thing was that one of the things that truly defines Locke as being so special is it wasn't built adjacent to anything. It was totally built as a Chinese community. So there's obviously pressure from, you know, even though the Dyes and the Browns and such took advantage of the Chinese population, the Japanese population of Walnut Grove, they also, I'm sure, extended pressure upon what they could and couldn't do. But Locke had a much more of a sense of a free base to be able to do, you know, what.
But Ping lived with us for many years. One thing I found very interesting was that he went back to China. Ping went back to China in 1946 after the war, and he went back for a mission. He was sent by Charlie to find if there's any opportunity to move the whole family back to China. Now, I was surprised. Ping didn't say much about it. He didn't elaborate, you know, but that kind of planted in my head as like, why would you, after all that years, why would Charlie send son back to, he was married already. Why would he send the son back to China to see if there's a possibility to move the whole family back? Of course it didn't work because the communists took over. Ping took the last flight, flew back and said, forget it. Don't even think about going back to China. So we often say, gee, imagine the move.
Dee told me that story. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But you said, Grandpa said, they don't want us here. Go back and find us a home. I think that's incredibly poignant.
Yeah.
That's 1948.
Yeah, he said that. You know, we were here for laborers and we were to make our money and take it home. And 86, I returned home back to my village, back to the house my grandfather built when he married my grandmother. And it was my first time there. Dao Xiaoping has really broken down a lot of barriers, made little economic zones all over the place, and my area and just south of Saki was one of the economic zones. I went in there, Mom has been there twice already, so she brought me, Dad was working for the store. I was single, I wasn't married. I went back on a mission to say, let's go back, see, you know, your roots. Well, my aunt came up, that I don't even know that she's my aunt, because I don't, you know, it's like your uncle in Fresno, it's the same thing, you don't know. And she came out, and there was, on the shelf, there's a deity, okay? She got up on a little step stool, I remember a little ladder, lit. She knew I was coming, so we had friends pick us up at the water terminal where the hydrofoil came in. And she lit the incense, okay? Now I'm, what, 30-something, mid-30s? She lit the incense and everything, and then she put the chicken up there. She put the pork up there, okay? And she goes, she took my hand. And my Cantonese was terrible then. It's bad now, but it was worse then, okay? He took my hand and he says, look at the deity, let's bow, okay? She said a prayer, and I understood exactly what she said in Cantonese. She says, thank you for bringing the grandson home. Boy, it hit me. It hit me really hard. You know, I had tears, I still have that feeling. But why would I have that feeling? Was it because Grandpa sent my dad to see we didn't belong here? That we really belong back there? I'm American. Family's been here 130, 120 some odd
Did you
years.
feel like you belong there?
Yeah,
When
I
you were there?
do. But then at that one moment, Jeff, at that one moment, I went, wow.
How did you feel like you belonged there when you were there? When she said that, is that the feeling you get? Like, are you torn? Like, I belong there and I belong here?
Yeah, in that case, I know I could never come back, but what she said was just something that was emotionally probably hidden in the back of my mind. That when she said that, she meant, I mean, we did a lot, every time I went back, we did a lot of praying at deities and stuff like that. She really believed that. And then she wanted my dad always to call when we got to America, said that she always wished us a happy flight and a safe flight, and call and said that we landed safely. My prayers are answered. I don't know.
Yeah, it's amazing story.
You know, that's one of those things that I keep precious to me, you know that.
But my question is, and maybe you can speak to it, the 70s, which is when you came to Locke, I think generally Chinese they close themselves off to outsiders, non-Chinese. And yet you were able to gain their confidence to tell their stories. I mean, stories they didn't even tell their sons.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you do that, both of you?
He became, an integral part of the town, and then we were smart enough. We hired Connie Chan, who lived in town. People were very comfortable talking through her to us, but it was because of his relationship in the town. So, yeah,
I'm just being myself. Just simply, and when I first lived on Main Street, it was very different. As I said, Stanford was essentially one of the few people that would actually come and visit me. The rest of the Chinese, my neighbors, were kind of just standoffish and such. And then it was when I moved back to Key Street that where things began to change, and as I tell in the book about this involvement that I had with Mrs. Leong, who came over and asked me to do some repair in this bathroom apartment that I did, and then I became, she would have, the exchange was that I would do this physical work in this bathroom, and she would feed me. It was great.
So you'll work for food.
You'll work for food. So,
well, also James is one of the nicest people in the world, if you haven't found out. He's an extremely open and kind guy. I mean, if it was only me, I don't think we ever would have gotten this book done. But he was taking photographs, and after a while, people saw, and then you gave photos of the people he was taking to the people, and they appreciated that. He had something tangible because we didn't speak Chinese, so that was it. He had something to
there
exchange.
was one pivotal event actually where things seemed like it crossed the demarcation line. And that was when I had been taking photographs around town, but mostly like of Mrs. Leon cooking and doing things of where there wasn't this kind of, you know, straightforward, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, doing that. But that turned one day, and I don't have an image in the book of it, but I was on my way to San Francisco, or the Bay Area actually. The woman I was dating, I picked some roses for. And Mrs. Leon was sitting on her porch, and you know, I walked by, I'm standing there with these roses, and I'm telling her I'm going to go off to, to San Francisco. And I gave her some roses. And she would just kind of just looked at me. And at that point I was always carrying my camera with me at the time. And she at that time said, okay, you can take my picture now. And she sat there on her porch looking directly at one. And from that led seemingly everybody else in town. I was able to take photographs. That's not the image right there. That's not the image I took that day. That's a different one. But from that, I was able to do the portraits of Wong Buck and his family, and Bing Fai Chow, and all the others. But it was that, and I have no. There is no logical. It's just me. It was what happened. And my involvement of being able to make these photographs. That's why I said that the epiphany I had was, of course, this realization that I had I had these photographic images that were very different than what anybody else had, and they were an important archive. And just to have them in a traveling exhibition that may travel some more, may not, and such, I had a greater responsibility to those images and the people that I got to know, and that was why the book came about. It was to really tell the more bigger story about, and which I didn't really realize. I only knew just, it's been a journey for me as well to learn about this remarkable, history and testament to these people who I was honored to know.
Yeah, but James, during that period of time, to answer your question, looking at, because I was here, but I was going to school. I was going to school and I was commuting each day back, so I didn't have the fortunes of being daytime here. And I think it was a transition period. You're talking the 70s. I was one of the last, I am the last big generations of kids that are born here that were already migrating out, going to UC Berkeley, whatever, or already got their degree and working. So the people, the older people in the block, all the young ones are theoretically all gone. There was no fresh, something fresh. James, a nice guy. He is a real nice guy. I admit that. He came in, and I remember my dad telling me when I come home from my commute, he goes, "Oh, there's a white guy living in town." And I went, "Really?" I mean, no, he just passing by. He goes, "No, he actually lives here." I don't know, white guy actually lives here? What's his name? His name's James something, I don't know. And he always said Guaylo. He's Guaylo. He's like, Guaylo's living there, okay. And I went, I said, whatever. Well, I met him probably a year, maybe 18 months afterwards. But we really segregated and avoided it. But I think the time was right, especially for the Leons and all the older ones that they're tired going out the garden, but they needed to eat. And it was a fresh face. Somebody talked to him. He was here during the day. All the kids were grown. They went to college. They're gone. They have their own families, gardens. There was that gap, that little gap. Humans need to communicate, no matter what race, And James he's a great communicator. He's great to talk to. I mean, it's interesting. Things he come up with, he goes, wow, that's great, Even when we got there cleaning the sewers, we had really a lot of things to talk about.
Well, I think that's what really bonded me.
I think we bonded, really, that's what it bonded. I told my dad that's bonded. I said, James belonged here. Any white guy get down there and help me clean the sewer, it's gotta be all right. So let's leave him here.
This was like
Not everyone did talk to us, by the way. There were a couple of guys who really, really, really courted to get their stories. Joe Chow and Hoi Ki But mostly they had worked in the gambling halls, they had worked in many of these businesses that we talked about, as well as legitimate business, quite very curriculum. They just didn't want to do it, I mean, a lot of these people had been illegal, but they didn't know what the hell they were doing. And they just didn't trust us. But Dustin, last year, said, you just should have got him a couple of blondes and a bottle of whiskey. Mentions that in 1919, they opened the road, the Levy Road, for the first time. You used to have to get here by riverboat or railroad. And once they opened up that road, it was just, that's what a lot of it really just booked. But, so I thought you knew YL, or the restaurant, didn't he start out, there was a Chinese restaurant.
Who's the
Yeah,
Chinese
Worked in the Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, my grandfather,
Yeah.
according to what my dad told me, since Li Bing owned a lot of, one of the original group of people coming, he built a lot of the buildings. And he always wanted to run, but he never had enough hands to run. That's what the idea of 40 years was. If you're born 40 years, he never had enough hands, so he had to delegate, and then they would take their share and say, well, I didn't get paid enough, so I'll take a little bit of this. And that's how it was really bad. That's why my dad, when he went into business, he just went to one business because of the experience my grandfather had. But that was supposed to be, if I'm right, it was a Chinese restaurant my grandfather had.
Yeah.
And he told my dad, go sell the place. But I don't know when, you got the years.
1934.
Yeah, so dad in 34,
Oh,
he was he out of Cal? No, he was
He's
still,
17 years old.
yeah, he was young.
He was born in 70.
Yeah, because he did everything because his dad was he was a lot older than my father, so he just delegated. He goes, well, you're old enough, you go ahead, do it. And he said, what I'm doing, sell it, get rid of it. But I didn't know the story that you told me. When you told me, I went, wow, this is so good.
Back in the 1970s, mid-1970s, this guy shows up in town, and he says he wants to do a documentary about Locke. Oh, okay, you don't want to do, all right, another guy. I said, I thought my defining question was, all right, we can get rid of him quick. And I said, so I go, you speak Chinese? Oh yeah. Here's this guy. Oh, okay. So it changes everything. Well, his name's Todd Carroll, and we become pretty close friends. Todd's story is that he did a PBS documentary about Locke called American Chinatown. That I don't know if there's any copies around anymore. We're trying to find some. But he ends up also, after doing that, becomes the ABC bureau chief for ABC News in Beijing. But is after the second anniversary, or the first anniversary of the occupation of Tiananmen Square, he's out there with his news crew to do kind of a follow-up of banners is supposed to be unfurled to commemorate the events. And he's then severely beaten by the Chinese secret police and ends his journalistic career pretty much. But before that, Todd and I were back in the late 70s and early 80s, we started to do a whole series of articles for what was called the East-West newspaper, East-West Journal. It was based in Chinatown. And from that, we were just essentially the same kind of thing here. We were thinking, what's an Italian restaurant doing in Locke? And so, this Al the Wops, which you don't know means without papers or without passport. So, Todd being the investigative journalist that he was, gets in the phone book, simple thing. He finds an Adami. And so he calls him up, and the guy goes, yeah, that was my brother. So we go out to the Sunset to do this interview. So the story is right there. You see in the bottom, in the middle section is actually that's Alexander Adami. That's Al's younger brother. So we go out there and he starts to tell us a story about how his brother ends up here in this all Chinese town. And it actually begins with their father, Alessandro Adami, who in 1901 is an Italian fisherman based in North Beach. And you've got to remember the historical context of North Beach and Chinatown. The Chinese did not go into North Beach. And the Italians very rarely went into Chinatown except to go and to beat up the Chinese. There was this, the
Broadway is a dividing line.
Broadway, yeah.
so you had, so the steamship, the city of Rio de Janeiro, which they just found the wreckage this last December, which has been, this kind of mystery ship. The headline in the Chronicle and such was in December of 2014, was the Titanic of San Francisco was finally found.
Bay Area's Titanic, 1901, shipwreck near Golden Gate found, December 10th, 2014.
Yeah. So the Rio de Janeiro was coming in. It had anchored off of where the Cliff House was to await the fog to lift and such. Well, it lifts in the early morning. The steamship weighs anchor and starts coming in. Well, for whatever reason, the pilot didn't read the compass heading right, or the deviation on the compass was not acknowledged, and runs straight into the rocks right off of Fort Point. Just in the western side of Fort Point, smashes into there, backs itself up, and Alexandra Adami, Alessandro Adami, who's out there fishing, hears this grinding of steel on these whistles and all this, and so the ship is backing out, and it promptly sinks. And all the Chinese, it has a large Chinese crew, there's a number of Chinese passengers because it was on its normal run between Asia and America here. So Alessandro becomes a hero to the Chinese community because he rescues boat after boat. He makes, I think, 2 or 3 trips coming in, rescuing these Chinese who are sheer death out there in the water. The Chinese 6 companies honor him, and they give him, some money, but he's also, in a sense, given the key to Chinatown as a hero to him. According to Alexander, they could go into Chinatown and get meals, and the Chinese would, brave, coming into North Beach on certain holidays and coming and giving them gifts. The Italian-American Bank, which later becomes the Bank of America, gives them, and he wasn't the only fisherman. There were a few that rescued the Chinese, and this is the plaque that's featured that Alexander shows us. What Todd and I don't tell the story so much is how Al shows up here, because we didn't feel it was okay. But years later, the story was that Alexander's older brother, by 1920, he's a pretty wild youth in North Beach, and he gets into some real trouble with some thugs, essentially, I don't know, the mafia or whatever, that he has to flee San Francisco in the middle of the night. He uses his father's Chinese connections essentially to come to the Delta here. I first heard that he arrived first in Isleton, and then he comes here to Locke. And this is where he then stays for these years. And how the restaurant actually comes about is that, I'm kind of speculating here, and it's not, you can kind of put together pieces that I've heard here and there. But essentially, Charlie Didi's grandfather, as a way to honor this debt that the Chinese had to the Adami family, essentially gives him, under very favorable terms, it was a restaurant. And in 1934, Al Adami then opens one of the only non-Chinese businesses here in Locke. And that's how you have this Chinese town honoring the Italians who they were, in a sense, at a war with. And this is part of this great American kind of story of where you have 2 immigrant groups who both suffer from the xenophobia, the anti-immigration, and yet here in this one instance they come and they help one another, and then eventually you have this helping of the offspring. And to me, it's one of those great stories of America that you have now in this all Chinese town. You have an Italian restaurant that's serving steaks and having governors, and in 1970 when I lived here, Jerry Brown used to come back here all the time. And we had heard during the 30s and 40s that this was a stop for the politicians coming down to Al the Wumps. Was it to do? So.
Will the investigator?
I don't think he ever married. There's the photo of him there on the thing too, standing out in front of the restaurant. No, he was pretty much of the cantankerous kind of small, little tough Italian.
Yeah,
Just,
he would mix the drinks when you order a drink. Instead of using a swiggle stick, he would put his finger in it and stir it. Okay, and then the guy goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "It's alcohol." So, and then he served you the drink, and the guy goes, "Man, this is crazy. This guy's, and you wouldn't fight him, what are you gonna do? Get in a fight with him? Look like he could, kick your rear pretty easy." But I remember Dad said, "Yeah, he'd stick his finger in the drink."
Oh, yeah.
And that's
He's
just like
a tough
serving,
guy, though.
just like serving tea with your thumb on the cup and say, "Here, have one,"
Well, we're going to try to have a commemoration of that event in 1901, the 115th anniversary next year. I think it was February 27th or something. And Al's just had a tragedy there. The owner of Al's just passed away suddenly from a heart attack. So I don't know whether we'll be able to get any kind of event together. We wanted to bring the Italian community and the Chinese community and commemorate this historic event and coming together of these two cultures. And I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but it's a great story. So that's all we have. If anybody else has some great tales, let us know.
Yeah.